In November, Professor Bruce Babcock from Iowa State University and I presented a briefing in the U.S. House of Representatives and the Senate on the question that's commonly called the Blendwall, which is to say whether U.S. biofuels policies keep moving forward beyond the 10% blending of ethanol and gasoline that we have today, or whether we essentially slow down or stop the progression of the policy at that level. What follows is Professor Babcock's presentation of his recent research. His talk is titled, Through the Blendwall or Not.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here and speaking to you today about the RFS policy. And I thought I would start my presentation by just kind of giving an overview of why we're here and why we are doing this briefing. EPA's decision about what to do with the 2014 mandates and the RFS has really important policy ramifications. And we want to discuss what those policy ramifications are and share with you some research we've done on the impacts of different policy alternatives here. The focus today won't be on biodiesel. We're going to focus on ethanol, and I hope why ethanol made from corn and ethanol made from cellulosic material, why we are focusing on that. So what do we want to cover today? Well, the first thing, as I said, we want to cover why the EPA decision is so important, why it's going to have large impacts on the future of renewable fuels in the United States. And we're going to address some of the reasons why people are against expansion or against the RFS, including the lack of demand for ethanol beyond what we use today, the impact on the economy from the RFS and compliance in terms of compliance costs with the RFS, the impact of the RFS on food prices, corn prices. There's a lot of opposition to the RFS because of that. And we really want to focus a bit on the path towards compliance and what kinds of pathways are there in order to comply with an expanded RFS. And really, at the end, we really want to focus on a broader policy question of how the EPA decision is going to impact the future of advanced biofuels. And when I say advanced biofuels, I'm really looking at biofuels that cut CO2 emissions by a substantial amount. So I want to start with just a kind of current situation with ethanol. The amount of ethanol that can be consumed easily and readily in our gasoline supply this year is about 13 billion gallons. So that's an important number, 13 billion gallons. Now, why is that? Why can we consume that easily? Well, since 2007, when we saw a great ramp up in ethanol production, we needed a place to use that ethanol. Not all parts of the country could use ethanol, and we had a blender's tax credit known as VTEC that really incentivized blenders to invest in the infrastructure that was needed to allow the RFS mandates that were growing through that time period to be met today. And the refineries have invested too. They've reconfigured, the oil refineries have reconfigured their refineries to produce low-octane gasoline to maximize the value of ethanol. So what we have today is refineries are producing very low-octane gasoline. They're blending it with 10% ethanol, and out comes 87 octane regular gasoline that we all buy. So they really like ethanol up to a point, and that point is about 13 billion gallons. The problem is that the amount of ethanol that is slated to be mandated in the future, the RFS, is really going to grow to at least 14.4 billion gallons in 2014 and 15 billion gallons in 2015. So essentially what we're looking at is we can easily consume 13 billion gallons, but the mandates are putting us beyond that number. And so what that is often called is beyond the 10% blend wall. And the question is, do we want to go there or not? So the big policy question we have, should we hold the mandates at easy to achieve levels of less than or equal to 13 billion gallons, or should we let the mandates rise above 13 billion gallons? And what we want to do is talk today about what are the consequences of that policy decision. So the oil industry has a very, what should I say, strong views on this topic, shall I say. They think it's mission impossible, that in fact the compliance with the RFS is going to not only be difficult or impossible after 2015, but in trying to push beyond the E10 Blendwall, we're going to have serious harm to the U.S. economy. And not only the oil industry is against pushing this RFS, anti-hunger groups are against it. The livestock industry is against it. Big other corn users are against it. So some of you might have seen this ad about the higher ethanol mandate. Diverting crops from food to fuel, we're the ones who pay the price. So there's a lot of belief that pushing that mandate is going to make all our food cost more. So what I did is I did a study on what impact would it be to hold corn ethanol production at 13 billion gallons, which it is today, or move it to 15 billion gallons. And to do that, we should recognize that we've seen dramatic swings in the price of corn since 2006. So what I have here is a chart of the corn prices in the United States since 2006. And you see that in 2006 we had really cheap corn. $2 corn, and people were used to paying $2 for corn. The livestock producers were used to paying almost next to nothing for corn to a lot of livestock producers. And then what you see is that we had a dramatic increase in corn prices to over $5, some modification when the Great Recession hit, and then a couple bad crops and expanded demand for corn pushed corn to record prices. What we see in the future is moderation, dramatic moderation of those corn price increases. And what we're actually seeing today, as you can see at the tail end of this, is that we're moving back down to $4 corn. So it's a far cry from $2 corn, but it's also a far cry from $7 corn. So what we're seeing is that we're moderating the price of corn because farmers have greatly expanded the production of corn, and we're seeing more efficiency in the use of the corn. So what I did is I said, let's look forward to a future with an expanded mandate or a future with a frozen mandate. And here's the results of that study. That if you hold ethanol production, corn ethanol production at 13 billion gallons, you get about 25 cents per bushel cost difference. And that's about a 5% cost difference. So if you assume that there will be no corn ethanol exports, that the industry will only produce 13 billion gallons, the most that it'll impact the corn market is 25 cents. So if you think about 25 cents, is that a big number or a small number? Well, it's a number that is greater than zero, but it doesn't seem to me 25 cents when we've seen corn move from 2 to 7, that 25 cents is enough to base an energy policy or base the RFS on. So it looks like that corn prices are going to be much lower than they have been in the last 3 years, and that whether or not we expand the RFS or don't expand it, that we're not going to get much higher corn prices. So let's move to another criticism of the mandate, that we can't use the fuel. So I have another ad here about the higher ethanol mandate and how it's going to ruin engines. So we have two ads here. One of the ads says that you got to go to the take your engine to the repair shop, and the other ad is a lady stranded on the highway, the worst circumstance around. Now, is that our future if we expand the mandate? Well, if you notice, these two ads refer to E15. What E15 is a 15% blend. So the problem with E15 as a compliance path is that if you want to consume 1 billion extra gallons of ethanol as E15, and remember, the mandate is in terms of biofuel volume, not blended gasoline volume. So to consume an extra billion gallons of gasoline, of ethanol in E15, you need to consume 20 billion gallons of the fuel E15. And to consume 20 billion gallons of E15, we need 37,000 stations to install an E15 pump. Currently, we have about 10 stations that have E15 pumps. It's not going to happen. E15 is not the compliance path is going to occur. So what is the compliance path? Well, in contrast to E15, we have another fuel called E85. That contains up to 85% ethanol, and cars that are flex fuel vehicles that are designed to run on E0 or E85 only those can use those fuels. The good thing about E85 from a compliance path is for each gallon of E85 that you consume, you get up to 0.75 gallons of ethanol net increase in consumption. So you can consume 1 billion gallons of E85 with about 2,700 stations versus 37,000 stations. So the investment cost in converting stations to cell E85 versus E15 are far lower. Plus, there's a dramatic number there's already a bunch of stations. So what we did is said, how much E85 can we consume? Is it a viable compliance path? Well, to do that, we had to know, well, how many E85 stations are there out there? And so I show a map of the E85 stations. And you see where they're concentrated in St. Paul, Minnesota, Chicago, Milwaukee. And is that where, and remember that we only can consume this with flex fuel vehicles, so I have a map of where the flex fuel vehicles are. And if you look closely, you can see the concentration of flex vehicles. There's a lot in the metropolitan areas, which makes sense that places where there's lots of vehicles, a lot of those, there will be a lot of flex fuel vehicles. So the question becomes, how much E85 can we consume with current infrastructure, and how much E85 can we consume with investment? And it's clear that the anti-RFS people, primarily the oil industry, has claimed that E85 is a failed fuel. Well, that's what we wanted to explore, so we have some papers here where we give you some outlines of what these numbers are, so I'll briefly go through them here. But here's a chart, and I try not to put too many charts here, but here's a chart of how much ethanol can be consumed if we take E10 and add the E85 to it with no investment. And if you notice on the vertical axis here, I have the price of ethanol. I'm an economist, and price matters. The experiments that have been run in Minnesota and other places say that when you make E85 a competitive fuel, people will drive their flex fuel vehicles, find the fuel, and fill up on it. And so what we have here is that the amount of consumption of ethanol will go up as you lower the price of ethanol. But as you can see here, the maximum level, given our study and given infrastructure constraints, the maximum level of with current infrastructure that we can consume of ethanol is about 14 billion gallons. Well, put that into perspective. Remember, we got 13 billion gallons that's easy to consume. And with current infrastructure, we can go to 14. Well, what about 15 and 16? Well, that will take some investment. And so what I've done here is said, how much investment will it take? And you can see what I've done is given you, again, we've created some short versions of the research papers that we've done on this topic. And you can look at those short versions and access all the details that you possibly want. So I'll spend a little time on this document that basically says that if you invest in the infrastructure and if you price E85 competitively, you will sell E85. You will sell a lot of ethanol. And what do I mean by a lot? Well, as you can see, what I've done here is plotted out how much ethanol that you can consume with E10 and E85. And if you were to invest in 7,500 new stations, you could get up to about 16.5 billion gallons. Now remember what kind of volumes we're talking about here. We're talking between 14 and 15 with the corn ethanol mandate. Some additional volume as cellulosic ethanol comes on, that we can readily consume that level of volume, but only if we make the infrastructure investment. So I did some back of the envelope calculations of what 7,500 stations would cost. The EPA estimates that if you have to break concrete, so maximum kind of cost of installing an E85 capability, it costs about $130,000 per station. So if you were to invest in 7,500 stations, that's about $1.125 billion. And if you think about that on a per gallon basis of fuel, transportation fuel, that's less than a penny a gallon for E10. If you think about it in terms of the extra ethanol that you could get, it's about 56 cents per gallon of 1 year's extra ethanol. So is that a lot of money? Well, in Washington these days, any amount of money seems like it's a lot of money. So it's some money, but let's put it into perspective. To the cost of breaking through the previous consumption bottlenecks of ethanol in terms of getting E10 infrastructure in the Southeast, California, the Northeast, and the Northwest, we had something called the VTEC. That was the ethanol blenders tax credit. It was 54 cents a gallon, then it was 45 cents a gallon. We were spending between $4 and $5 billion a year on that VTEC to build out that E10 infrastructure. I'm talking about $1 billion here, one-time investment for E85 infrastructure. But we don't have $1 billion lying around to spend on an investment fund for E85s. So what's the incentive for someone to do it? Well, that's where you get into RIN prices. The only incentive that people have today to invest in E85 are through the RIN prices. So the RINs are the RIN market is a compliance system. It's a market mechanism to make sure that the price of the RINs signals the economic returns to essentially investing in biofuel production and consumption infrastructure. What do I mean by that? Well, suppose you're an oil refinery and you're faced with $1 RIN. That's a substantial cost of operation to you. And so what, as an oil refinery, do you want to do in response to that $1 a gallon cost to you in terms of the RINs? Well, there's two actions you could take. One of them is, if you could generate RINs, then you have a valuable commodity to sell at $1. Well, how can an oil company generate RINs? Well, they can enter into a partnership to become a blender of biofuels. They could become a blender themselves. They can generate RINs. They can invest in E85 stations with an agreement with a blender that supplies the E85 to that station, that they'll split the extra RINs. They can generate RINs through strategic investments. The other thing that they can do is they would want to lower the RIN price by any means possible. So the first thing they want to do is get rid of the RFS, because then the RINs go away. In fact, if you give what they want in terms of not breaking through the blend wall, the RIN price is going to go to zero. So that's their first best alternative. But let's suppose they can't get it done. Well, what are they going to do then? Well, they're going to want to lower the RIN price. Well, how do you lower the RIN price? Well, what you do is you make E85 more widely available, increase the demand for E85, and that will lower the RIN price. So the compliance cost will go down as you make E85 more variable. But it only happens if you have that high RIN price. If you drive that RIN price down to zero, you're not going to get that investment. Well, that's my background, but I want to leave you with a few pictures, or two pictures. You look at this, it looks like what does it look like? A bunch of hay bales. Well, what are they called? They're stacks. These stacks of seemingly hay is actually corn stalks, corn stover, and what they're springing up everywhere around, up in central Iowa and northern Iowa. They're springing up everywhere because companies such as DuPont, and here's the proof, DuPont cellulosic ethanol, are putting together their supply chains to make sure that they can access this biomass material to make cellulosic ethanol. So the cellulosic ethanol is starting to become a reality on the ground.